Yeah, so the title is The Trial of Prisoner 043, and I'm sure you all are out ahead of this. Of course, George W. Bush was the 43rd President of the United States. And it imagines, it's a novel, and it imagined that he is abducted off a golf course in Scotland and transported to the International Criminal Court to stand trial for war crimes of which he's accused in connection with the Iraq War. Many people want to know right off the crack of the bat why I wrote this novel, and I will just tell you it's because I love my country a lot, and I think we fight too many wars, perhaps unnecessary wars, and we have to do something about it as citizens, or they will continue. Also, there was an English poet who wrote in the 19th century that the pen is mightier than the sword, and I thought I would just put his theory to test here and write a novel. I also want to say here at the outset that I have no grudge against George W. Bush, and this is not a personal vendetta in any way. I actually know George. I met him more than 50 years ago when his daddy, as we used to say, was an oil man in Midland, Texas. So was mine. And I played Little League Baseball against George W. Bush. He was on the Cubs. I was on the Braves. I'm too modest to say who won, but the Cubs lost. I can tell you that. And when he was a young oil man in Houston, I was at the University of Houston, and we saw each other socially, which is saying something because it was in the days when he was pushing it pretty hard. It was lots of fun, I can promise you that. And even when he was governor of the state of Texas, he invited Ann and I in for a 20-minute meeting that lasted, 3 hours, telling stories and all that. You may know, some of you may know him, but he's a very charming guy. He would win, most personality contests. But governance is not about popularity. It's about doing the will of the people. I think it especially applies to war and peace and the sanctity of human life. And so I set out to tell a story that I thought just had to be told. And most writers, they have at least 3 potential sources of content. Obviously, it's what they know and what they can imagine would be first. And second, interviewing lots of people who are knowledgeable about the subject. And finally, research. And of the 3, I actually love research. Frankly, just to make a confession, I don't consider writing labor. I have a tremendous amount of fun doing it. More than anything, I think it's artistic, especially if it's a story that you just have to tell. With all due respect to women, it's a kind of a thing for me that I just couldn't stand not to tell this story. It was just in me in a way that the arc of my life would not have been complete without telling this story. For some reason, for American citizens and for mankind, I just had to write this story. So 4 years ago, I launched out, and as I said, I love research and did really tons of research. First of all, I knew nothing about international criminal law, but I did know that it was so unlikely that George W. Bush would be put on trial in American courts that it immediately had me begin to explore other options. And one comes upon very quickly the existence of international criminal law and the presence of, very much the presence of the International Criminal Court, which stands very proud in The Hague, and the International Criminal Court is there when the host nation of a suspected criminal is unable or unwilling to bring an accused to trial, then the jurisdiction goes to the International Criminal Court. The other thing that I kept in mind in the beginning is that my great mentor and friend, Roone Arledge, who was the godfather of ABC Sports and created Monday Night Football, he created that wonderful legendary series, ABC's Wide World of Sports. And the mantra that he co-wrote with Jim McKay was, many of you remember, but it's spanning the globe to bring a constant variety of sports, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, the human drama of athletic competition. So these weren't games with just scores. These telecasts were about the people. And he taught us something that I will never forget, especially valuable as a writer. And I'm not only a novelist, but a playwright and a screenwriter. But the 3 areas to look at are man against an opponent, Man Against the Elements, and the most rewarding and interesting of them all, Man Against Himself. So I'd had a lot of experience in storytelling, and again, I'd written a screenplay or two and a play or two, but I decided that this story was so massive and so dense that I didn't think it could be accommodated in screenplay form or as a play. And that launched me off into writing a novel, which I can tell you, in all the things that I've ever tried to do, it is by far the hardest thing I've ever done. I call it a literary ascent up Everest barefoot. And it just again, the other thing about a novel, you know, when you have a play or a movie or a Super Bowl or the Olympic Games, it's about something else. I mean, you're telling the story about other people and other things. No, a novelist starts out with a blank piece of paper, and it's sort of there you go, there but for the grace of God you go, and it's a tremendous experience, and so much is on the line. I can't believe I started doing it, but I'm happy I did. I'm not sure how many more I can write, but I was glad I did it. So George Bush decided that this all becomes quickly about the Iraq War, and actually the story of the Iraq War begins with 9/11. I don't have to tell people in this town that 9/11 was the September 11th of 2001. Bush had been inaugurated and president in January of that year. September 11 occurred, and there was a huge outpouring of sympathy and love for the United States. And his approval rating at that time was 90%, one of the highest approval ratings in the history of American presidency. He had every legal justification in the world to track down and bring to justice Osama bin Laden, who most of the world knew was in the mountains of Afghanistan, hiding in and around. But after more than a year, and with all the huge might and intelligence of the American military, he had not been able to bring Osama bin Laden to justice, which is already a kind of a curious thing. From where I come from in Texas, they say, if it looks like a skunk and smells like a skunk, it's a skunk. There was something wrong about that. And even though we had him in our sights, for those of you that know the story about Tora Bora and other times, but he didn't give the executive approval to fire the shot that would get Osama bin Laden. And just not so parenthetically, Osama bin Laden, Barack Obama got him with 16 Navy SEALs that went in and finally did the job. But then after a while, and he did not get Osama bin Laden, he began, as you all will remember, to change the dialogue to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the first thing he did was to try to create linkage between Saddam and 9/11. Now, there were 19 terrorists on 9/11. 15 of them were Saudi Arabia, 2 were from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, and 1 from Lebanon, none from Iraq. The fact is Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, if anything, he was an enemy of Saddam Hussein, long-standing enemy of the two. Once it was proven that Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, Bush changed his narrative to the idea that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. How well we remember that, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, that accusation launched hundreds of investigations by international weapons experts, UN experts, the United States experts, in hundreds and hundreds of potential locations, unobstructed, to find weapons of mass destruction, and over a period of time, none of them had been found. Not one weapons of mass destruction. And yet George Bush continued on his march to war. At that time, as we got into 2003, many of the leaders of some of our greatest friends, France, Italy, Japan, Australia, pled with George W. Bush not to rush to war. He was warmongering, beating the drum for war, creating the idea that war's got to happen was a fait accompli. They were pleading. Even the Pope sent a personal emissary to George W. Bush, a Christian man, begging him to wait for the inspections to finish to determine once for all. But he didn't wait. And in March of 2003, he waged his war. I will tell you that at the build-up and during that moment, the largest single protest in human history occurred. It was estimated that 36 million people at 3,000 different points of protest rose up with their voice to protest the beginning of that war, and yet it started with the shock and awe. And the United States forces, along with coalition forces, invaded Iraq. Most of you know the results of that, but the first thing that in only a matter of months, Baghdad had fallen. They had torn down the statue of Saddam and drug it through the streets. The Iraqi army had been completely neutered, and they found Saddam hiding in a ditch in Tikrit and arrested him. So another question is, why after, specifically that all of that took 9 months, so it is now we're at December of 2003, why didn't he stop the war at that point? All of his, and most importantly, when coalition forces got in there, remember that Bush got the U.S. Congress to grant him war powers and sent Colin Powell to the UN to convince the United Nations that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell. After coalition forces were there and were months looking for weapons of mass destruction, none of them were found. For the simple reason, and the facts are, that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction and had not had them since the 1980s. That's the fact. And yet that was the pretext that created the basis for the war. Keep in mind also that American law says that war can only be contemplated when there's a clear and present danger. Clear and present danger. We need to think about that. Some of us remember Vietnam. We have to think about Iraq. We have to think about that in present time. Clear and present danger, of which there clearly wasn't. And by the way, and when you read the book, which I hope you do, one interesting thing is this: what George W. Bush knew and when he knew it. We all know the story mostly that I've told you about this march to war. What you'll find in the book is what he knew and when he knew it. So the war begins, and the story gets even worse. The war lasted 8 years and 9 months, and we killed 4,491 U.S. soldiers. I say 4,491 because every single one of those lives matter. It mattered then, and it continues to matter, and we can't forget it. We, the people, cannot forget that, because if we forget that, it by in a de facto way sort of condones that it happens in one way or another. We doom ourselves to future wars, which becomes part of the theme of what we'll talk about a little bit tonight and as it relates to the book. There is an interesting anomaly about modern-day warfare, somewhat parenthetically, but modern-day warfare on a percentage basis kills less soldiers and wounds more. For instance, in the Vietnam War, many of you will recall, we lost 58,000 in the Vietnam War. There's two reasons for that. One, in modern-day warfare, the body armor is more effective at protecting the vital organs of a human body, and we have more medics, and they get there quicker, and better medicines to save lives. So proportionally less soldiers are killed and more are wounded, and thus 230,000 Americans were wounded in that war, physically and or mentally. And we are paying for that to this day for sure. As if all of that's not bad enough, we killed a million Iraqis. A million Iraqis. They were not our enemy. They were not our enemy. And we killed a million of them. As Americans, we have to ask ourselves, how do we feel about that? Now, the other thing that we have to, the human life, the loss of human life is one thing that has to be kept front and center. But another thing in the conversation is the treasury that we spent fighting that war. So we have spent We spent and are spending between $4 and $5 trillion. Now, for those of us who don't deal in orders of magnitude that are that high, a trillion is 12 zeros. It's 100 billion. And we have spent between $4 and $5 trillion, among other things, trying to care for our wounded warriors, which we sure as hell need to do and continue to do. But think about that, $5 trillion. You know, our elected officials are put in there to service the people, to do the will of the people, not fight wars that are unnecessary and could be avoided. Think of what we could do with that treasury. And by the way, I don't have to mention and remind everybody in this room, that treasury comes from us. We pay our taxes. That creates the treasury. We empower elected officials and government to do the will of the people, so they go fight wars. Think about what we could use that for. Increased education. Most of you know that of the 20 most advanced countries, we've gone from near top in terms of education to the bottom, to 20 in terms of education. Think of what we do to eradicate poverty, education, better schools, more teachers, higher pay for teachers, crumbling infrastructure, a debt that's, you know, gagging us and choking us as a country. There's plenty of things that we could use our treasury to do to service the people and make our lives better than spending it on unnecessary wars. But the war, on the war goes, and it persists, and I'm changing the thing, seeing what I forgot here to say. Okay. Don't want to forget anything. It looks like this. I can't read it either. My eyesight's not that good either. But in my story, George W. Bush is put on trial for war crimes at the International Criminal Court. Now, it takes a little context for everybody to kind of get a good tack on this story. International criminal law was basically created by the UN following World War II and following the Nuremberg trials, which, as you all know, put the Nazi criminals, commanders on trial. Hitler and Goering, cowards that they were, committed suicide before the Nuremberg trials. But the trials, after due process, found the Nazi commanders guilty, and they were put to death. Following that, the United Nations convened an international symposium on international law in Rome. And 159 countries from around the world gathered for months to discuss, debate, agree, and draft upon the essence of international criminal law, intended from the beginning to stand above all national courts when they are unable to exact justice. We have now the International Criminal Court and the ICC, which came of force in June of 2002. George Bush's war started, as we know, in March of 2003. So he becomes the first leader of a superpower subject to international criminal law. So he's put on trial, and he's put on trial for war crimes. There are other natures, crimes of aggression, but there's 8 definitions of war crimes, and they're what you imagine. They're murder, prisoner abuse and torture, one I have to read because it's extensive destruction of civilian property not justified by military necessity, and the list goes on. So he stands trial. Now, a central part of my effort to do this, after reading tons of books about international criminal law, taking online courses, I have to tell you, you have to pass it to complete it. I flunked it twice before I finally passed it. I was greatly aided because most of all of the principal characters in my book have written their own autobiographies. George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, General Tommy Franks, Richard A. Clarke, who was Bush's chief counterterrorism expert in the White House. Great books have been written about the Iraq War. One of them was by Bob Woodward, no less. Another one by Michael Isikoff and David Korn. That's fabulous research material. And I access those things unashamedly. I say in my book, and I tell everybody without fail, I'm as much an aggregator of content as I am a writer, because I wanted to get their exact voice. I wanted to understand not only what they say, but the contextual feeling of it and the emotionality behind it. So when I was done with all that study about international criminal law and reading all these books and amalgamating this, I sent the book to two international law experts, one of them in the United States and one of them in the UK, to vet it, because the last thing I wanted is for the book to be discounted as not authentic and not real. And both of them came back with virtually the same opinion, which it was letter perfect with regard to international criminal law. So you can be sure what is said in here is completely authentic, and the jurisdiction of it is completely authentic as well. I also need to say that I tried from the beginning very hard to advocate equally and aggressively for both sides. I did not want the writer's voice to sway the day. I wanted to argue very, very aggressively for both sides, and I created really powerful, smart prosecution team and an equally powerful, smart, vengeful defense team to weigh this case. And I did it because I wanted the reader to decide for themselves as regard to innocence or guilt. You should also know that in international criminal law, there are 18 judges at the ICC. They don't have juries. So every case has an odd number of judges. Usually it's 1 or 3, at the most 5. And once a judge, an international criminal law judge, is assigned to a case, he cannot recuse himself. Once he's assigned, he has to render jurisdiction. He can listen to the case. They can try it any way they want. But the judgment in an international criminal law is sent down by the judges. But in my book, I wanted the people to be the judges, and I think I've done a fairly good job. You'll judge for yourself. But most people say that it's a very balanced story, and I tried very hard to make it so. The other thing is that as a story writer, we all know that the thing that propels drama is conflict. And conflict is defined as 2 or more opposing forces in opposition with each other. So the greater the forces, the greater the drama, the greater the conflict, and the more interesting it becomes. Wasn't so interested in entertainment as much as I was engaging, educational and engaging. And ultimately, I think the story becomes fascinating and entertaining on certain ways. Yes. Yes, and I think what I wanted to do also in this book is to tell the story as accurately and as sequentially as I could about the Iraq War as a referendum on war and peace, using it as an example of how does war happen? How does war happen? You have an idea about it, but is for sure elected officials combined with the military, and we all remember that Dwight Eisenhower, the last public address he made when he left the presidency, he warned us of the military-industrial complex, that unholy alliance between the military and big business, corporations. Their lives go better, their future goes better, the funding comes in, profits go up. I'm basically quoting Eisenhower. And they have an accomplice in this warmongering, and that's the press. Because as long as bad news sells, the press loves to feed the warmongering. They take it and they feed it. And so what happens is that, listen, no one would say that all wars are unnecessary, because of course that would be ludicrous. We can point to World War I, World War II, the Korean War. Things come along, and I also advocate for a very strong military, very powerful military, to protect and defend America, Americans, and our friends, but not wage wars against countries on the other side of the world who do not represent a clear and present danger to the United States, and we do it too much. I was a young guy during Vietnam. That war stunk. You people may know about it. The more you drill into that war, starting with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, just that was a monumental overstatement of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, leading to massive problems. But we haven't learned our lesson, and we come along. You know that the Gulf of Tonkin happened in 1964, and that war was over in 1972. So here we are in 2003, waging another war. And so, you know, I wrote it because I think that there's, and when you think about it, but when I did and extrapolated out what can stop this madness, in my opinion, after giving it a lot of thought, there's only one thing, and that is an informed and engaged citizenry, the voice of the people. Just think about how the Vietnam War finally ended. Protesters in the streets by the millions. The Union Square was one of the great anti-Vietnam, I'm pointing wherever Union Square is. The people went to the streets, grabbed microphones, and said, this is enough. The voice of the people. I think that's the only thing that can stop wars. And by the way, I'm hopeful if in just some small way people read this, and people ask me, you know, is it going to be a movie? I hope to God it's going to be a movie. What I hope it is going to be a miniseries, a multiple episode miniseries, done hopefully in English, but done in many of the languages around the world. Because a citizen today, whether he's President 43, President 44, or President 45, is not just a citizen of the United States. He's a man of the world. He belongs to all of mankind. And the communication is such with the internet and travel and all of that, that more and more we're becoming less a parochial citizen and more a citizen of the world. And thus the importance of international criminal law. And thus the importance of the existence of the International Criminal Court. So I hope a byproduct on this is that people read this story, they learn from this story. Hopefully it's informative, entertainment, but they learn from it, and they become galvanized for the future. Because, not to be redundant, because in some ways, I think, and I don't mean the purveyor of doom, I think it's our only chance, folks, for us to stand up and be counted. And by the way, my plea is before these next wars start. So some people say, they may wonder or say that I'm un-American for writing this story. Well, I tell you, you could hardly find somebody as American as I am. First of all, I am a descendant of a family that arrived on the Mayflower, a direct descendant of the second president of the United States, John Adams. My father was born and raised in Minnesota. My mother was born and raised in Ohio. I was born in Denver, Colorado, and raised and educated in Oklahoma and Texas. I am that guy for the Star Spangled Banner who's standing erect, hand over heart, singing way too loud and way off key with a tear in my eye. I love my country, but I want it to be the great country that our forefathers imagined that it could be and has been, and we can make again. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. By the way, I've read since then that self-evident were Benjamin Franklin's words. Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be obvious that. Benjamin Franklin changed it to, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now let's just remember, all of our forefathers were immigrants. All of them were immigrants. When they wrote that Declaration of Independence, the basis of what America came upon, they were referring to all of the people of the world. That's the vision of America. That's what I want us to get back to so much that I'd take 4 years of my life writing this book, publishing this book, and hoping you'll read it and enjoy it. Okay, I'm done. Oh no, I have one other thing to say. It's the most important thing. Okay, full stop, new thing. This happened last week. to give you, some people may say this could never happen, or it's okay. Let me just tell you two pieces of information. Last week, a ruling came down from the British courts. There was an Iraqi general who put Tony Blair on trial in British courts. And they have been, for the crime that they accused him of was the crime of aggression. And they had tried it in British courts, and the ruling came down from, I love this, the Lord Chief Justice. That sounds very British, doesn't it? And the ruling, and I'm quoting here, there is no crime of aggression under domestic UK law. Now, when you think about that for a second, that is an open door for that Iraqi general now, because remember that local courts, domestic courts, have first right of prosecution. And the ICC's jurisdiction doesn't trigger in until or unless the home state either is unable or unwilling to try and find guilty a criminal. That's when the jurisdiction transfers to the UN. So this ruling that just came last week, it allows this Iraqi general now to transfer the case to the International Criminal Court, where for very sure the crime of aggression does fall in that jurisdiction. The final thing to say is that when a suspected criminal is accused under international criminal law, there is no statute of limitations, which most of you know means that a suspected criminal is subject to trial until the day he dies. So while it's highly unlikely that this story could happen, it's not impossible. And this would provide a kind of a roadmap. But I'm not so interested in George W. Bush. I'm interested in the future leaders. This is the thing that my target was on, you know, not George W. Bush. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to you.
No,
No, yes, no.
I have a mic. One thing you didn't explain is why George W. Bush as opposed to Cheney or Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz.
Do you want to do it? I think they're tired of listening. I'll do it.
No, I think you better explain.
So in international criminal law, yeah, the question is, well, what about Cheney? What about Rumsfeld? What about Condoleezza Rice and everything? Under international criminal law, it's a bedrock principle, and this is the exact language, that the single person most responsible is brought to trial first. The single person most responsible. And as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, just be assured that war would have never happened if George W. Bush didn't lobby for it, however convincing and personable he is. He was the Commander-in-Chief. He's responsible. Now, should the single person most responsible be found guilty? Absolutely, the International Criminal Court it can bring his accomplices and put on trial as well. Okay. Now, do you have anything else you want to add, madam?
No, I just want to make sure you didn't leave anything out.
Okay. I try. She's here at great expense just to make sure I don't blow things. Thank you. Okay, Peter.
If we wanted to open it up to some questions, if anybody has one, you can raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. See, the dog is perking up.
I feel like I should be singing karaoke. Donald Trump right now is sort of chomping at the bit to start another war, either with Korea or Venezuela. Or what do you think his motivation is for warmongering? Because clearly he really wants this.
Yeah, so the question is, I think you may have heard of it, where do we think Donald Trump stands in this question of waging a possible unnecessary war? I have to say we've done books signings in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and I think every single time it was the first question, so thank you for that. I also would have to say that I don't mean to cop out, but other than saying what I've said with regard to the stipulations that a country has to represent a clear and present danger, and that Congress to the United States, of course, and our allies, and that it's only Congress that can grant a president war powers. I have to say, I think I feel like a lot of you do in this room, and because, well, this is a personal opinion, but he does seem to be a kind of a quick trigger sort of a guy. It's kind of like, I think we used to say, in Texas, shoot, aim, think. A certain guy, shoot, aim, think. I think he may be, again, I don't want to be political, but he may be that, and I just hope he's not. And a lot of people had said, by the way, I hope someone gives him this book. Because, again, he's not just a citizen of the United States. He may think he is. I don't know. I have no idea whether he knows much about international criminal law. But it would stand him in good stead that he does.
Any other questions? I had one, if that's all right, if I may. You mentioned that 4 years ago you realized that George W. Bush would never be prosecuted in the real world for war crimes. Was there a particular moment or news story or current conversation that you had that did it to you, or what did it kind of grow out of a long-standing realization that presidents don't get indicted for war crimes?
I think it had to do less with that cognition and more to do with the fact that I became aware of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I had the great joy of directing some of the major championships of golf, and had spent a lot of time in Scotland, and had traveled a fair amount in Europe, and had gone to the International Criminal Court because it fascinated me. And when I realized that was there, I thought, well, hold on for a second, because in fact, there was a book, a very wonderful book written called The Prosecution of George W. Bush, which was one of the first books I read, as you can imagine. It was written by a very interesting man by the name of Vincent Bugliosi. He was a prosecuting attorney in Los Angeles, who wrote the definitive book called Helter Skelter about the Manson family murders of Sharon Tate, et cetera. So he writes the prosecution of George W. Bush, but in his story, Bush is put on trial in an American court in Washington, D.C. And I thought the likelihood of that is just, well, just think about it. I mean, Fidel Castro's never going to stand trial in Cuban courts. The Nazi criminals were never going to stand trial in German courts unless the guy in North Korea. So it takes a court of the world. Once I understood the capacity of the International Criminal Court, that was the open door to relook at the Bush situation, and the fact that it, as I said, it came of force in the summer of 2002. And Bush's war started in March of 2003.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Did you send the book to George? Did I send the book to George? No, I haven't seen him in a while. And, there's a fair amount of people that are wondering about it. Some people say that he actually shouldn't make a comment about this or try to stop it. This is not my opinion, but people have said many times when this subject comes up, the best thing that could happen to my book is if he tried to stop it. If he commented on it and tried to stop the publishing of this book. First of all, published date was August 1. But if he rose up and commented about it, he said what he said and did what he did. But I haven't heard from him. I'm not going to wave it in his face. I don't know.
He's probably not going to Scotland, though.
I bet he's not going to Scotland anytime. Yes.
Now, so Tony Blair has to be much more cognizant of ICC grasp and reach.
Absolutely.
This new decision affect the way he's going to lead his life going forward.
Well, that.
I mean, not that we know the answer to that, but it must occur to him that I don't know that I want to stray too far from home, or especially if he's read your book.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And it is so. They say people who are suspected of international crimes, they are not advised to leave the sanctity and security of their home nation. So that's just the UK. But yeah, I just thought with all 4 years of this process, and the ruling just came down last week in UK courts that the crime of aggression was not covered by UK law, domestic law. Wow, because that would have to happen in my story. That before the entry, before the book could start, that this thing would have to have some look in an American court, and they would be unable or unwilling to do it before when you read the first page of my book, that would have happened. But that sounds like a boring way to start a novel, so I started in a different way.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terry and Ann, for coming out. Let's give them a round of applause.
Well, thank you for coming.